this point in time, I had given up on ever winning a car at the Diamond Casino's Lucky Wheel. Obviously, Francisco did not need to win a car, with free stock race cars he could buy online with one click, and several wonderful motorcycles that we never used anyway because we only took taxis around. But every session with Francisco begins at the casino, and it would be foolish not to spin the lucky wheel before embarking into whatever chaos was unfolding outside. In doing so, being reminded that there was a special car on the podium, and those deserving of such a wondrous fate would go home with one. Sure, I had won all kinds of monetary rewards and clothing and something of value every single time, so I increasingly saw this wheel simply as a universal basic income to offset Francisco's daily expenses, keeping him free of desperation and focused on greater, meaningful pursuits. And I had all but forgotten the dream of a prize car hand-picked by fate or chance or the singularity, no longer hoping for some special economical smart sedan or perhaps an otherworldly race car that would keep him off the ground. I had not even looked to see what kind of car was on the podium, and of course it was this time we were rewarded it. A car, in quotes, which I did not think necessarily reflected the kind of person I thought Francisco was. However, and anyway, I'd still like to thank the singularity for this behemoth, the kind of vehicle that requires a stepladder to enter and 2 degrees of global warming worth of fossil fuels to operate, because it does look like it would keep Francisco safe. In fact, this new feature of Francisco's garage made me wonder if it could be used to safely collaborate with others, and arrived around the same time a new business opportunity opened up in Francisco's world. As I've said before, we most often use taxis to get around the streets of Los Santos, primarily to avoid the accountability of any collateral damage that might occur from others driving or running around recklessly. However, this decision to stay out of the driver's seat often fails to acknowledge the collateral damage suffered by the taxi drivers themselves. It would be a fair estimate to guess that 1 out of every 5 taxi drivers Francisco meets will experience some degree of trauma, and 1 out of every 8 will not complete the requested trip, if they even had a chance to begin it. Fortunately, very recently we discovered the downtown cab company was hiring, and thought this would not only allow Francisco to earn some extra fun money, but save some lives by not calling a cab himself. I'd also hoped to attempt to use the HVY Insurgent to safely transport riders around, and intended to offer it up to the taxi company as I somehow avoided the temptation to compete in an arm wrestling challenge outside. Francisco was hired on the spot, given a fare immediately, and was also disappointingly given a taxi cab to drive instead. I considered attempting to repaint the HVY Insurgent blue and yellow, but I wasn't given any menu options to use my own vehicle, and I figured I should stick with the fleet, whose insurance claims adjuster must have already had Francisco's name written down with a big angry circle around it. The first fare I was assigned wasn't too far from the taxi depot, and a few suspect U-turns later she was excitedly dropping her coffee cup perfectly downwards and entering the back of the cab. Francisco and I were informed that passengers' tips decrease if the trip takes a long time or if the taxi is damaged, which I figured wouldn't be a problem. What we might lose for stopping at every traffic light we'd make up with saint-like defensive driving practices. My fare didn't seem to mind all that much, although she did put up a protest for the longer traffic signals.
Why are you stopping?
But the tips still far exceeded the expected 0%, and it looked like I had found Francisco's new calling. I began to imagine what this life could be like. I wondered what the rewards for completing a certain amount of consecutive taxi fares was, what interesting places and people he would meet. I wondered if I'd ever get to upgrade his taxi or paint his HVY Insurgent blue and yellow and put the little taxi light on top. Or if an armored taxi would be overkill. And after safely stopping at what must have been the 1000th traffic light on this trip, I learned that it might be nice to have an armored taxi after all. I'm not sure what Francisco had done to upset a player in a minigun-equipped HVY Insurgent, but for some reason I felt an obligation to flee from this player's destructive tendencies and protect the NPC, who for some reason was clearly choosing to remain inside a vehicle which had just been completely overturned. Francisco, of course, seemed alarmingly on board with stepping on the accelerator, and although I did think for a moment this was simply a case of mistaken identity, I was weary of finding out how many lost doors it would take for someone to identify a person. Now, obviously there was an inherent risk in driving this way, but there was a risk in driving at all, and the choice to pick up the controller. At a certain point, wielding any power comes with all the consequences of simply having that power, and the choice to drive aggressively defensively could come with all sorts of unintended consequences. The alternative, of course, is to relinquish power, to reject life's opportunities, to never dream, to never grow, but in accepting the power to shepherd someone toward their desired destination, I decided to commit to use this power and try my best to keep this person safe, and would need to trust that faith in that respect for life's opportunities would help guide us the rest of the way, especially, as was the case here, if we did not remain on the ground. Almost as quickly as Francisco's crumpled taxi became the meat in an SUV sandwich, we slid into the mission drop-off, completed the fare, and said our farewells. As our pursuant sped off and away. They too were now fleeing their own antagonist, a player with a vehicle-mounted rocket launcher, intentionally or not serving as a guardian angel with a rocket launcher. I was thankful for fate and the singularity getting us here safely as I ceased operation of this liability machine. I was thankful for the structural integrity of this one-time use taxicab and the opportunity to successfully use my power and skill to protect and shepherd another person through this dangerous world, if only for a limited time. I had hoped she wasn't too upset with Francisco. Her 164% tip seemed to indicate that she wasn't, and before I had too much longer to reflect, she did the seriously most absurd thing I'd ever seen an NPC do in Grand Theft Auto Online. Re-enter our clearly doomed death trap to sit back down next to Francisco and the rockets that were chasing him. For a computer-driven person to look out into this dangerous world and identify the cab of Francisco's dilapidated car as the safest place to seek shelter really flipped a switch for me. Maybe NPCs had important business imperceivable to us. Business that primarily needed the human element of faith-driven risk or human-driven taxis. Maybe people who had the ability to appear and disappear out of reality were seeking something more important than simply the persistence in that reality. Maybe NPCs loved the thrill of the ride, of the chase, with their precise coffee cup drops. Maybe they loved the joy of the human deviation from the most predictable path. And maybe they need people like Francisco to walk with them on their path and take them where they are programmed to go. Without us, would they even exist? Without us, who would spin the wheel?